Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 14. The Pass to Aryn. The little food and continuous walking soon affected Gareth's ability to think clearly. At times he could not remember where he was going at such a pace, or from what exactly he was fleeing, but a nameless urgency kept him moving westwards. His chest had become a numb hollow where the recent events hid themselves from the light of day. His mind refused to travel the road back to Belruth and the tree, or forward to some impossible destination in Aryn. It merely plodded on with his tired body to a hungry bed of ferns at night, an icy bath in the morning. At one time he staggered onto the main road to Kerris and sat down on a milestone, too tired and hungry to move. He had removed the scarlet surcoat since it would identify him too easily, folded it tightly, and shoved it through his belt. The air was much fresher here, being so close to the northern mountains and the high pass cutting through them. Any stirring of the breath from the snowcaps dispelled the suntide's heat in these borderlands, and reminded the inhabitants of Rhymesong's perpetual rain in the high places of Myrol. A light breeze brought these tidings home to Gareth as he sat upon the stone, and he was soon shivering. Could he risk donning the surcoat for a while? He had just about made up his sluggish mind to do so, when he noticed the approaching ox cart and the black robe of its occupant. A moment later he was hastily winding his way through the trees, hunger and fatigue forgotten, his mind considerably clearer than it had been for days. He kept well to the north of Kerris, though it meant struggling through dense patches of forest. His hunger had receded to a dull pain inside him, mingling with the ache already there. He had come across a struggling hare in a crude trap, but since he had no means of starting a fire and had not the heart to eat it uncooked, had settled for half-ripe berries instead. That night he had suffered with cramps and cursed himself for a fool. Ere long he passed the walls of Kerris and had to take extreme care in finding his way to the pass. Nurian patrols scoured the countryside here during the suntide seasons, since the fair weather and higher temperatures would allow raiders to slip through from Aryn. The men were mostly from the hill tribes that had lived here since time immemorial, and knew the lay of the land as well as could be. Though they would certainly not recognize him, he could not risk their reporting his presence to the authorities in Kerris, who would undoubtedly realize the truth and send him straight back to Belruth once apprehended. No, here he would have to avoid all human contact, whether he was starving or not. A few miles past Kerris, the road started climbing steeply towards the pass. The broadleaf and air trees had given way to formations of pine and fir, which carpeted the forest floor with their browned needles. To lessen the gradient, which occasionally was so severe that he had to stop from time to catch his breath, Gareth was forced in many places to keep close to the road where it cut through the hillsides. His strength waned quickly on account of his famished state, and he realized soon that he would have to find proper provisions, or he would never reach Aryn. Ahead of him lay the pass, stretching for leagues through the frozen peaks of the crown of Myrol, with little prospect of food or shelter. 4 or 5 days of steady marching would bring him to the Tower Lake, which he had only seen on the maps of his tutors. A further 2 days under the shadows of the impossibly tall towers themselves to skirt around it, and 2 or 3 more to reach Gryn in Aryn left him with at least a 10-day of hardship for which he was ill prepared. Ever so often he caught the smell of smoke in the cold air. The huts here housed guards and runners, used to carry the tidings of an invasion or raid to the beacon men on the lookout posts, who in turn would warn the towns beyond. It happened when passing one of these guard huts that the breeze carried with it more than the odor of burning wood. The men of this hut had been fortunate enough to trap and kill a sizable boar, and were roasting it for their evening meal. The maddening smell was more than he could bear, and he crept closer under cover of the thick mountain gorse. He kept hidden to await nightfall and a possible chance of silencing his gnawing insides. Haig was in high spirits. The wolf pelts he had taken so far would fetch a considerable price in Garrus. Tonight he had hopes of adding several more to his stock. The boar was a big one, and even after his 4 men had taken more than half the meat to roast for themselves, there had remained enough to bait at least 5 of the 8 traps. He did not care much for the taste of boar himself, but he knew the hungry wolves would find it irresistible, and their appetite would soon lead to his profit. He smiled to himself. These border duties could be turned to one's advantage. His men were also in the best of moods. The supply of ale was still ample, and their traps kept them living like kings. Moreover, the border had been unusually quiet this season. The Arynites were still licking the wounds that had been inflicted on them during the previous suntide. The raids had been repulsed with heavy losses, thanks to the vigilance of the border guards and spies. It had become an unprofitable and dangerous business to venture through the pass into Nuria. When the men offered Haig a sizable portion of the meat, he refused at first, but suddenly changed his mind. Though he would not let them notice his intentions, he had found a use for this fare he normally turned down. As soon as the flow of ale had taken its course, he would slip out and visit another of his traps. 6 traps were better than 5, and it would only cost him an unappetizing meal. He smiled again, revealing the stained teeth of a friend chewer, and emptied his cup in a single gulp. Gareth had almost worked up enough courage to approach the hut when the door opened, spilling light and noise into the dark night. There was jesting, counter-jesting, and much laughter tinted with ale-induced joviality. For a moment he saw the black priests at table in Belruth. Why were men everywhere willing to make themselves into such fools? They submitted without protest to the embrace of a cruel master who exacted his dues in weakness and unmanly conduct, in a tottering step and mindless stupor. It was beyond his understanding. Then he remembered the old store-master and his dependence on the wine flask. Perhaps it was a comfort to them in their loneliness, or in the cold, as it was to Hubin in his empty little cottage. The thought of the old man seemed to increase his own solitude, to the point where he almost felt akin to the imbiber of an anodyne, even while he knew the false comfort it offered would not last. The figure of a man passed through the doorway, and abruptly the brightness vanished. Lauren's eyes were glaring from the east, allowing Gareth to follow every move. The man strode through the dark with purpose. This was no evening stroll. He evidently knew where he was going. Out of curiosity, Gareth stirred from his hiding place and kept behind the walking figure. Some half a mile from the hut the man halted and knelt down among the bracken. He unwrapped something he had been carrying and carefully deposited it there. What would he be hiding here, away from the prying eyes of his companions? Could it be something he had stolen from them? He did not follow the retreating figure back to the hut, but instead waited till he was out of sight. Then he crept forward to where the person had hidden his loot. Surprisingly, it was no bauble of copper or even gold the man had dropped here for later collection, but a leg of roasted meat. To his food-crazed mind, this was strange behavior indeed, even if it supplied his need most conveniently. A tiny voice of warning still penetrated his eagerness and made him wary. He lingered a moment or two, the feast barely 2 paces away from him. He listened intently, but there was no other noise above the soughing wind in the needle trees. The bracken softly brushed against his legs and arms as he squatted before his prize. Then he could resist it no longer. Perhaps it was the days of running and hiding, or maybe some deep awareness of concealed danger that had sharpened his senses, for he had no sooner grabbed his prize than he felt a slight shudder as the tension in the metal jaws was released. He heard the faint swish as they rushed to snap shut and crushed the bones of his wrist in their embrace. Then he had twisted his body away, still clutching the meat, while the closing trap sent an empty clang into the night. He was shaken and sat down for a moment, breathing heavily, not quite understanding his escape. Then he hurried away, not certain if the sound of the trap had carried to the departing soldier. By the time he had tossed away the leg bone, licked his fingers, and found a hole to spend the night, he had realized his stupidity. Of course, there would have been no reason for a man to hide meat out in the woods, if it were not to trap some predator like a wolf or bear. Hunger had clouded his thoughts to such an extent that he had almost lost his liberty and in all probability his life. He felt suddenly weak and vulnerable, a fox in his hole, but one that could no longer trust his instincts. Gareth was aware of the men before he saw them. The morning had been a grey one, but bright, the cloud cover high and solid. He had scarcely dressed after a freezing wash in a streamlet, when the by now familiar prickling at the back of his neck sent him scurrying for cover. He moved furtively till he had gained some height, and then, frowning against the glare, peered in all directions. They were half a mile away, and definitely tracking him. He recognized the gait of the burly man in the lead from the night before. There were 2 others with him, periodically examining the ground to find signs of his passing. They had almost reached the hole in which he had spent the night. He lost no time. The fox was on the run again, for the first time having the hounds in sight. It was strange how fear and excitement increased his pace over the rugged terrain, and he had to slow down ere long or become winded. He headed away from them to the north and west, ever higher into the foothills and dense undergrowth. Darker clouds had massed to the northeast, and though the running warmed him, he could feel the sharp drop in temperature since the early morning. There was no wind, and his breath steamed steadily before him. It was almost painful to draw the cold air into his lungs, and he forced his breathing into a rhythm with his footfalls. Towards the end of the noon watch, the sky had darkened even more, and tiny flecks of snow were floating down. Gareth was tired and cold, wondering when he dared stop for a breather. His pace had slowed somewhat out of necessity, since the sloping landscape and slippery rocks made hasty going too great a risk. At first he was grateful for the falling snow, despite the corresponding chill accompanying it, since it would cause the trackers difficulties if they fell too far behind him, covering the faint signs of his passage with a white blanket. But while aiding him in his escape, the icy shroud could soon become his very own. If the entire pass looked like this, he would not get far. The high country between Aryn and Nuria was a strange and inhospitable no-man's land, of tall, unbroken mountain ranges, stretching for unexplored leagues of frozen waste in every direction round the Tower Lake. The peaks stood stark and white against the skies of all seasons, devoid of the vegetation that crowded in powdered greens through gorges and valleys, straddling sun-tide streams and the long limbs of the foothills. The hurrying boy had penetrated a good 4 miles of the rugged terrain, and had reached the miniature plateau, like a giant step, with higher slopes and peaks beyond. Numerous broad fingers reached from the heights across the relatively level ground of the plateau, forming shallow or blind ravines in between, through which there was no easy passage, if any at all. Into these now Gareth trudged, seeking one that would afford him a thoroughfare. He could hardly risk entering a dead end and having to double back, perhaps into the arms of his pursuers. Yet he would have to attempt it sooner or later. The pass was well to the south now, and every step he took widened the gap. The guards were too close behind to evade for long in the pass anyway. Moreover, his fear of capture, fueled by an image of the horror tree, sporadically interposed itself between his heavy breathing and tiring stride. He could not will himself to circle back, even if for a chance of eventual escape. Haig's mind raced ahead to where his quarry twisted and turned over the plateau. He had little doubt that this was an Arynite spy on his way back through the pass, for whom the reward would be ample. It seemed to be an inexperienced one, though, for there was little or no attempt made to cover the tracks. These they had been able to follow with relative ease from the robbed trap. This miserable wretch would see what happened to one who interfered with Haig's business. There was something odd about the tracks, though. Despite the fact that they were not very clear, he realized soon enough that they were rather small. Since the Arynites did not employ children as spies, they were either tracking an extraordinarily diminutive enemy, or the spy was one of the Vadran settled on the far side of the pass. Though he was an experienced campaigner himself, he had no desire to tangle with one of these overly magical folk. They were notorious for their ability to go unseen, and since this one was easy to follow, it made him suspicious to its intentions. Was it leading them into some trap? He could not be sure. When he had told his men of his misgivings, they had loosened their weapons in the scabbards and strung their bows to keep them at the ready. He was annoyed at the first fall of snow, but soon realized that if they managed to stay close, the snow would leave an easier trail to follow, provided that the fall was not too heavy. Then he realized that the Arynite was even less intelligent than he had anticipated. The spy's intention was clear: to slip through one of the many ravines leading further into the mountains, but he evidently did not know the terrain too well. There was no suitable exit to the north, and he would have to keep working his way westwards till he was close to the pass itself. It would be a simple matter to anticipate this maneuver and steal a march on him. He would be cut off from escape and forced to retrace his steps to the east. That is, if he detected what they were doing in time to avoid being captured outright. Gareth's determination was fast giving way to concern. Every ravine he passed seemed either too steep or overgrown to allow him the quick passage he needed. It was quite dark to the north, where heavy snow had to be falling. He had both his hands under his armpits to keep his fingers from going entirely numb. The tall trees around him were too sparse to protect him from the now thinning snowflakes, and he had to brush them off from time to time. Little banks of snow accumulated here and there in low shrubs or mountain grass, and he wondered where he would find a place to sleep that night. He fell into a pensive state, occupying his eyes with selecting the path for his feet, and thus it was that he never noticed the men until he was nearly on top of them. A dangerously deep gully yawned to his left and forced him onto a rocky platform, fringed with several trees and a thicket of gorse. Loose rocks lay scattered over the platform and around the edge of the tear in the ground. He stopped for a moment to peer down, and when he turned back they were there, 3 men in fur coats, 2 with weapons at the ready, blocking his way. He knew it had to be his pursuers who had outsmarted him. He glanced back the way he had come, but one of the men immediately moved to cut him off. The largest man of the 3, the one of the night before, stepped forward and addressed him gruffly in the track tongue.
Stay right there, boy. There is no escape now.
Haig approached carefully, as he would a wild and unpredictable animal, till he was a mere 2 yards away. He held his hands away from his sides, the palms outwards, as if to show his good intentions. He was smiling slightly, revealing the stained teeth, but Gareth was not taken in by this display at all. The man held his eyes as he spoke again.
You have permission to move through the pass, boy.
He moved even closer. Gareth merely stared at him, his mind racing. The man interpreted his silence as a no.
Who are you, and what is your business here?
The voice had taken on a new menacing quality. The man who had moved to cut him off shifted his feet, and readied himself, as if he half expected the spy to shed his Nurian disguise, and fly at them in his true Vadran form. He was nervous, and still young, his face pinkish in the cold, his beard only beginning to shape. Gareth could not think of any reply that would satisfy these brutes. He was suddenly angry that they had trapped him like this, that they could threaten him into revealing his intentions. The words were out before he could consider the effect.
That is no concern of yours.
No concern.
Powerful hands gripped the front of his surcoat and nearly lifted him off the ground. He was swung away from the abyss, and his back pinned against a tree. Gloved fingers gripped his jaw and pressed into his cheeks. All the while he was aware only of the man's flaring eyes and nostrils, his intense anger over this impertinence.
And robbing me traps? Be that no concern of mine either, you little runt.
His breath, reeking of Friend, washed over the boy. Gareth's own anger and loathing intensified. He hissed his reply through clenched teeth.
Release me, beast!
At the same time he braced himself with a foot against a tree. He tensed his body like a mountain cat.
Let me have him, Haig. You shouldn't be singing a different tune.
This came from the other guard, who had been quite passive till then. He dropped his bow carelessly and unsheathed the long, wicked-looking knife. Dirty grey hair peered from under his hood and framed his weather-lined face. Haig turned to look at him in annoyance and relaxed his grip for an instant. The boy felt the rough bark through the shirt and surcoat on his back. The memory of another tree and another body turned his anger to rage. The blow fell quicker than the striking of an asp. His palms rammed into the man's fur-covered abdomen, taking him completely by surprise. Then he twisted his body, thrusting himself forward with his legs, and slammed his shoulder into his captor's chest. There was an odor of wet, moldy fur, and the overpowering stench of Friend, before he was clawing, spitting, free. Haig took a staggering step backwards, struck his heel against a block of stone, and spread his arms wide to regain his balance. His staring eyes testified of his astonishment at the ferocity of the assault. He was staring still when he lost his footing altogether and fell with a choked cry over the edge of the chasm. Gareth had not lingered to witness this, and Haig's cry was but an echo in his ears as he wove through the trees to the north. He was in one of the many gorges offering escape into the mountains, and this time fate had decided which one he had to trust. He felt empty and light, leaping from one stone to another, scrambling over loose, ice-covered shale like a hare. In a while there was more shouting behind, and he knew the pursuit had recommenced. Haig had fallen no more than 10 or 12 feet before the slope came up to meet him, and his winded body slid to a halt. He was perched on a narrow ledge, 100-foot drop still yawning beneath him. The fur coat had protected him from injury, but would not aid him if he should slide off the ledge. He called for his men, forcing his voice to remain steady. Momentarily, both their heads appeared over the edge in response. Then a broken branch was extended to him, and having removed his gloves, he gripped it tightly, testing its strength. Gareth was forced ever higher up the gorge. A copse of needle trees promised some sanctuary from the relentless pursuit of Haig's men.
if he could reach it in time. An outcrop capped with snow masked his dash for the trees. His breath was racing now, like a stag before the hounds. He had to keep his mind clear and calculating, resist the rising panic. A sudden shout broke his resolve. He had been spotted. 3 figures were rounding the outcrop even as he reached the trees. The sides of the gorge were too steep to scale now. He could only run further up till he was backed against some cliff. Freshly fallen snow crunched beneath his hurrying feet, his lighter tread giving him a small advantage as his pursuers came slipping after him. The snow-laden needle branches welcomed him in, but he knew they could afford no refuge now. He broke cover on the other side of the copse, on a level stretch that seemed to end, to his horror, in a steep rise with little shelter. A skilled bowman would have no trouble picking him off the slope. He whirled around in desperation, close to panic. A giant fir tree towered in the center of the clearing, its girth testimony of the countless cycles it had stood guard on this mountainside. Beyond it, the slope was covered in snow, sheer enough to warrant a slow, careful ascent. The men were in the trees already, cursing and loud. It was too late to double back. Impossible to flee any further. He was trapped. Would they even believe who he was, these hillmen? Or would they simply dispatch him then and there, worn out and angry because of the long chase? Capture and eventual interrogation by the priests somehow seemed even worse. How could he face those wretches again? The murdering filth. They would smile and speak soothing words, and as soon as the backs were turned. How had they killed him, the cowards? That poor simple shepherd boy. They had torn him to shreds and left him for the ravens. The memory of it took the remaining strength from his legs. He slumped against the immense trunk, allowing the waves of hopeless fury to wash over him. He would not show them fear, these butchers, and if he were fortunate they would kill him quickly, a slight bother that dragged them from the comfort of their lice-infested huts. They would have their fire and their ale, and what matter if they reported this disturbance or not? He struggled to control his breathing and slow his racing heartbeat. The running had warmed him, but he drew up his knees in anticipation of the returning cold. The shouting had died down. A strange silence hung over the copse. Gareth stared at the tree line with the wide eyes of an animal. His breath steamed out in little clouds of warmth, turning to droplets on the icy leather of his wrist brace. Moments passed in silence. Then he saw them, 3 huddled shapes, just inside the trees, staring in his direction. One had already unslung his bow in anticipation, but now seemed loath to fit an arrow. Their gaze was fixed in open anguish somewhere beyond him. A sudden gust of wind stirred through the needle branches, sifting snowy powder down on the motionless group. They came to life. An argument ensued that seemed very one-sided. The youngest of the 3 was quite willing to risk a shot in Gareth's direction, but the other 2 grew wide-eyed at the suggestion and gestured angrily towards the tree. Without another word, they pulled him back by the sleeve and disappeared into the copse. Although they were hidden from sight, Gareth could not count on their leading him a way of retreat out of the gorge, now that they had been prevented by some miracle, even from taking a shot at him. He picked himself up and turned to look at his savior tree. A chill spread through his bones as he looked up its wide trunk. 10 feet up, a skeletal human foot had been tacked onto the flaking bark. It was joined to a brittle-looking skeleton that seemed too large for an ordinary man. Some remnants of clothing adorned the outstretched arms, but not a shred of flesh remained on the bones. The massive skull had apparently been separated before the body was nailed up, and was arrayed on a metal spike some inches above the rest. It was clear that the tree and its grisly display was a marker of some kind, indicating an invisible borderline. It was the border the men of the hill tribes were mortally afraid of approaching, or they would never have let this easy quarry escape them. As things were, all they had to do was wait for him in the trees. He had no way of escape, and hunger would eventually drive him out. He glanced around at the narrowing slope of the gorge, trying to carve out a route upwards. There were hand and footholds enough, with slight scrubby vegetation in abundance, poking up through the snow. Gareth approached despite his apprehension, but when he was making a final survey of the slope, he saw a man standing motionless some 20 feet up. He started violently, but realized almost instantly that it could not be one of his pursuers. He would easily have spotted any attempt to outflank him. The stranger looked down at him, his arms folded, his face partially hidden by the hood of a thick cloak. His very presence on this mountain slope, and on the other side of a fear-inspiring boundary marker, gave him an air of mystery and filled the onlooker with unease. Gareth suddenly understood the strange gestures and retreat of the guards. They had probably spotted this lone figure long before he had. Keeping his eyes fixed on the hooded face for any warning of danger, he approached the slope with caution. The wind had risen and was tugging impatiently at the man's fur cloak. It gave the odd impression of movement, although he remained completely motionless. When he spoke, Gareth could hardly see his lips parting.
Turn back, boy. You shall only find your end here.
The words were Nurian, but were archaic in dialect. The voice was cold as the wind, with a hollow, unused quality. It was no more than a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the gorge and touch the very stones of the mountain. Gareth slowed his approach, trying to control his shivering.
Come no closer.
The echoing voice was urgent now, commanding, and yet it carried a tinge of uncertainty. The air came alive with it, rippling like a pond at the drop of a stone. It was a barrier that prevented further progress, a wall of force. Gareth's own voice sounded small and light in comparison.
Please, sir, I am in need of...
You!
The figure was peering at him strangely.
Why do you come here? It is too soon. Too soon.
There was real fear in the voice now. The strange air made Gareth's skin crawl. The numbing cold caused his speech to slow.
I had no choice. The soldiers... I'm cut off from the pass. Can you not direct me? Is there no other way over the towers?
The man stared long and hard at him. Then he flung back the hood of his fur cloak to reveal the face of a man still in his youth, but with hair the color of a snowdrift. He took 3 deliberate steps forward, and at once seemed much, much older. A prickly sensation swept over Gareth, leaving his face numb. There was something terribly wrong with this old young man.
You know not who I am?
The smooth brow was furrowed in puzzlement. The eyes beneath it betrayed a trace of hope. This time Gareth had seen the lips mouth the words, but the sound still seemed somehow detached from the body before him. The wind stirred again, like another he had felt some time before, and he stared at the figure standing above him as if it had been woven from a dream. His own voice felt far from him.
Am I to know you?
There was a sad little smile on the young face.
Perhaps. You may recall our previous encounter in time.
At once the boy noticed another feature of the odd face. It was the familiar eyes.
You are Nurian.
The smile widened.
You do not know me, that is clear. A cruel fate it is that keeps one locked in ignorance.
Suddenly sure, the man descended till he stood in front of Gareth.
I shall aid you, for the sake of contingency. Will you accompany me?
Gareth smiled in return.
I have nowhere to go.
He hardly knew what to make of this sudden appearance of a way of escape, nor did he trust the stranger in the least. Was he being foolish? But then what other option did he have?
Close your eyes. It is best.
The voice was reassuring. The boy did as he was bid. He felt a hand placed over his eyes and pressed down firmly. He had been shivering for some time and had to clench his teeth to keep them from chattering. But this touch penetrated far beneath the chill of skin and muscle. It was cold as death. He drew in his breath sharply. An arm encircled his shoulders. A word was spoken that held no meaning for him. And then he felt a momentary sickness of vertigo wash through him. He reached out involuntarily, his fingers searching for the furred coat where there was nothing to take hold of. Abruptly, the pressure on his eyes ceased, and his groping hands made contact with something of substance.
You may open your eyes now.
From the cessation of movement in the mountain air, the sudden warmth and the loud, full sound of the voice, Gareth knew that he was inside some cave or structure, even before his sight confirmed it. His companion at once spoke the commands for the stone fire, and a bright bluish glare instantly lit up the walls of a windowless chamber. 3 oddly shaped arches marked doorways that could once have contained wooden doors, but now gaped emptily into the dark beyond. The walls themselves were solid stone, roughly shaped but strong and proud. This was not the palace of a dandy. It was a place of function and purpose, imposing its closeness like a living presence. It was ancient beyond reckoning, where the unpolished bareness whispered of mysteries known to none but their equally ancient exponents. Some vague memory tugged at Gareth's mind as he took in the room with its dusty stone benches and decaying hardwood chairs. It had something of the ruins of the old Belruth castle, as if the same hands had shaped both. An archaic bond, now indefinable, linked this room with a Nuria that was altogether different to the one he knew. His strange benefactor had taken a step back and was regarding him steadily, as though he was trying to gauge the boy's mood. Gareth stared at him in turn, suddenly distrustful.
Where are we?
His tongue was thick and heavy. The man tilted his head to one side.
Inside the mountain, in one of the many anterooms. This one, like the others,
He sighed.
no longer in use.
There was a slight whispering echo, as if the walls themselves sighed with him. A discomforting thought presented itself to Gareth.
We are inside the towers?
No doubt you have many questions, but it is perhaps more needful to introduce ourselves first. It has been a while since I have had the privilege, but I believe it is still customary.
The boy stared at him, as if he found it hard to understand the words. Then it occurred to him that he had no inkling who the man was, to whom he had of necessity entrusted his well-being.
I'm sorry. I am in your debt, kind sir, and I do not even know your name.
I have many different appellations from many different people. To the Nurians, I am known as Kennath. I am the keeper of the long-deserted realm of Vir the Seer. I was permitted to remain here after the cleansing, on condition that I conceal the entrances and deny any visitors entry.
The cleansing. But that was...
About 600 cycles ago, yes. Some of the children of Myril are blessed with exceptionally long lives.
And you live here? In the towers? Are there others around?
Why had no one ever told him this?
I live here, yes, and not quite alone, but...
He held up a hand as Gareth readied himself for another question.
First, let me know who I am supplying with all this information.
The boy hesitated, and in doing so, gave himself away.
You are thinking of telling me an untruth.
Gareth smiled wanly.
I am a fugitive, you understand, and I do not know...
Whether I shall deliver you to your pursuers. I could have done that at the marker tree, had it been my desire. Or perchance you suspect me of some sinister design in which I need to sacrifice one of Veer's children?
Though his tone was slightly mocking, only his mouth smiled. Gareth bit his lip and tried to think. Had the man not recognized him already? What had he said on the mountainside? Why then go through this little charade? Was it some kind of test? He was overwhelmingly tired, and found it increasingly difficult to think clearly. He decided to trust this man, though he was probably being foolish.
My name is Gareth Seth Fingor of Belruth. My father is king there. I am his second son, or I was, till a few days ago. I trust that he believes me dead.
He swallowed audibly. Somehow speaking his father's complicity out loud had magnified the sense of betrayal and rejection.
I had hoped to escape unnoticed to Aryn, or anywhere he cannot reach, but after today there would be little chance of that.
He looked up into the frowning eyes of the keeper.
He desires your death?
Gareth nodded. Emotions were welling up inside him, and he did not quite trust his voice.
You are sure of this? Pardon my asking, but why would a father seek to destroy his own issue and second heir?
I couldn't say. Perchance they told him what I knew, what I had done, or he hated me because of my mother.
They?
The priests, and Quester Talon. He has always hated me.
Your mother, the queen.
The dam burst.
He killed her. He let them kill her, and they killed Riot. I gave him the naming sigil. I gave it to him, and they thought he was the prince. You should have seen the blood.
He covered his face with his hands. Kenneth waited politely until the boy had composed himself and wiped away the hot tears on his sleeve. He folded his arms and continued their conversation as if nothing had happened.
The queen is dead, then?
Yes.
Gareth did not look up. He wondered to himself how this man ever received tidings of the outside world.
Some 15 days ago.
He sniffed loudly.
I was not aware. I have been watching the developments down south too closely to pay attention to the Viron.
He shrugged.
It makes little difference.
He smiled indulgently.
But come, you are fatigued, and probably famished. I have little in the way of provisions, since I do not receive many visitors, but I am quite able to speed you on your way, after I have satisfied my curiosity.
He led the boy through one of the dark doorways. The passageway sloped upwards past many more gaping black arches, before leveling off into a well-lit chamber showing definite signs of habitation. Embers were still glowing among the ashes in the hearth. Scrolls were strewn everywhere, on chairs, the large table, some on the floor. The wall shelves, with scores of neatly sorted tomes therein, were free of dust. The crystals beamed from every side. A heavy air door was set in the opposite wall. There was even a faded tapestry, depicting an unfamiliar landscape, with circling Broadwings to one side of the hearth. Gareth understood that it had been some kind of meeting room, a place where men of power in former times had discussed and shaped their plans. They had somehow become part of the place, and he could almost see them still, in their exotic clothing, representing many different regions and peoples, poring over maps, whispering and pointing, animated in heated discussion. One, set apart in manner and hidden motive, kept to himself in the background, observing, dropping a suggestion here and there among the eager participants. He leaned away, smiling to the shadows, his pale visage impossible to read. Then he turned towards the doorway and stared straight at the boy, his smile fading abruptly.
Gareth?
Who is that man?
His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Someone was shaking him, calling his name. The unfamiliar group faded till only the scattered scrolls remained. Kenneth's grip was painfully cold on his shoulders. His body felt limp, his legs buckled beneath him.
Sit down, over here.
Strong arms propelled him to one of the chairs, and he tried to resist, the faces of the previous occupants still too clear in his memory. Kenneth stepped away from him once he was installed on the chair, and jingled the small silver bell he had retrieved from among the scrolls. The response was almost immediate. The tapestry, which till then he had believed to be a single unit, parted, and into the room stepped yet another shape of legend. Gareth stared. The man was slight of build, even for his height, which was no greater than the boy's, not quite reaching to Kenneth's shoulder. His skin was pale to the point of sickly, and his dark eyes seemed overlarge for his face. His ears, nose, and chin were sharp and angular, giving him a crafty, fox-like air. Dark, straight hair fell to his shoulders. He wore a fur-lined greenish coat over his heavy woolen doublet and hose. Kenneth at once engaged him in conversation, speaking in undertones, and in a language unknown to the boy. The tone was one used more to an equal than a servant. The small man nodded once or twice, spoke in his turn, and stepped through the curtained doorway again. Kenneth turned back to the staring boy.
You see what is hidden from the ordinary eye.
It was a statement more than a question.
It is the most taxing of Vir's gifts, but also the most powerful.
He seated himself at the head of the long table, and started clearing away and stacking some of the scrolls.
There was a meeting. Here.
A lingering memory, nothing more. This was the council room of the 10. In ages gone by, they gathered here to shape the world according to their will. Yet there has been no such assembly since the summoning. Those that remain now, each practices his intrigue in a different corner of Myrtle.
He smiled wanly.
Sometimes I, too, hear their voices still.
Gareth narrowed his eyes and frowned. He suddenly found it hard to concentrate on what the man was saying, or he would certainly have overwhelmed him with the unanswered questions every new explanation inspired. He had never heard of a council of 10, nor had he any idea what they could have been up to. He was immensely tired, his head throbbing with every pulse through his veins, as if these had become too small and tight to allow the passage of his blood. He looked away at the stone slabs footing together beneath his feet, and tried to think of nothing in particular. He hardly noticed when the Vadran reappeared through the covered doorway. He nodded dumbly when this diminutive man introduced himself as Kenneth's companion, Sith, looked on as a steaming bowl was put on the table in front of him, and slowly emptied it when told to. He was aware enough to enjoy the warm goodness of the food and fire, and afterwards the embrace of the hot, soapy water and comfort of a bed. Somewhere among all these sensations, the cold faded to a distant memory. Despite the fact that he was exhausted, Gareth had trouble falling asleep in the unfamiliar bed, and once he did, he slept only fitfully. He was awake before Sith arrived, with his freshly laundered clothes. His limbs were heavy still, when he thrust them into the garments which the Vadran, like a servant, held for him. He was acutely embarrassed to be served, even in this small way, by a creature he admired so much, and some of his reluctance was noticeable.
You are afraid of me?
Sith spoke Nurian as well as a native did. There was amusement in his voice.
No, you are so...
His laugh was light and breezy.
Do not believe all the tales you hear around the fire. No, nor even those the tutor holds to be the truth. There are but few of the Vadran who are gifted in the art. Most of us are only tradesmen, or farmers, or merchants like any other race. It is only because we keep to ourselves that people multiply strange tales about us.
He straightened up to face the boy.
It is true that we choose whom we will serve, but that is perchance because we are not prepared to embrace ignorance as easily as others seem to.
Some of the strangeness was dispelled by this address, and Gareth could discern from his voice that Sith was amiable and unassuming, if a little reserved. He made no reply, but managed a little smile in return. The Vaedran conducted him back to the council room, where Kennath was already waiting. He had about him an air of urgency, and engaged the boy in conversation, while the latter still gulped down a meal of cooked fish and flat bread. There was a raised eyebrow when he asked for water instead of the ale that had been put before him, but neither the man nor his strange servant commented on it. Kennath explained shortly that he had pressing matters to attend to, and would have to depart ere the afternoon watch had commenced. He would help the boy on his way to Aryn as best he could.
In fact, I will place you where you may find more than a mindless border guard who would slit your throat before you had time to explain your presence. I am acquainted with the men on both sides of this pass, since I keep an eye on their activities.
He smiled.
And pride myself on being a good judge of character. If you strike westwards for, say, 3 miles at the most, you should run into Aronites with a little more sense than the average.
He stood up and placed the last of the now neatly stacked scrolls back onto the shelf. Then he beckoned to Gareth, who had finished his breakfast.
I have something to show you before I port you back into the pass. This way.
He indicated the doorway through which they had entered the day before. Gareth nodded his thanks to Sith before hastening off after the retreating figure. Within a few strides he had caught up. The passage was lit with the blue crystals as before, and the solid rock of the walls and floor echoed with their footsteps. There was an odd movement in the air, and a distant, low sound barely perceptible, like the sough of the far-off ocean recreated in a giant shell. The old realm of Vir had to be enormous, stretching for many miles and delving deep into the bowels of the towers. One could easily imagine the vast hollow and its numberless passageways like arteries within the mountain as some living organism respiring in its cavernous slumber. Gareth was almost sure that something was alive here still, despite the many signs of disuse. At length they reached the well of stairs, stretching up into the dark and out of sight. The command brought the shaft and the spiraling stone steps set into its sides to light. The boy stared in wonderment. The crystals here were a darker hue than the ones in the passage, and marked the vertical tunnel in deep purple illumination. Kennath smiled at the gaping boy, then made a swift ascent of some 40 feet, before disappearing through an arched doorway at the top. Gareth caught up with him in what appeared to be another small bookery. Numerous shelves all but filled the walls, and from each protruded tomes and scrolls of varied shape and size. The man paid no attention to these, however. He had halted beside a brass-bound door on which was depicted an elaborate pattern of some indiscernible purpose, in the center of which glowed an amber chrysolite eye. Daylight streamed through blindingly as he opened it. It seemed as if they had stepped through into a cavern or overhang high up in the towers, but there was no movement in the air, or the high breathing sound of the breeze in the open. The far wall, along all 40 feet of it, and for its height of about 10, was entirely transparent, letting through the sight of a mild sun-tide morning, or what would have passed for one if they had not been inside the snow-locked mountains. It was cold, perchance because there was no hearth or fire, as in the other rooms, and Gareth shivered involuntarily even as he stared. The pupils of his eyes had already contracted to mere slits, reducing the sudden glare and rendering the smallest details of the scene discernible. The height of his vantage point set the visible horizon at a breathtaking distance. Far, far below he could make out the icy blue waters of the massive tower lake that required a steady walk of 6 days to circumvent, but now appeared small and insignificant. Beyond it stretched the ridged mountains, gradually slipping from beneath the shroud of snow as they marched steadily towards the south. There was the smoke over the fire mountains in Argoth's hand, where the endless ranges of the north finally fell in enormous steamy fingers into the ocean. Then the deep blue of the far-off sea held the entire skyline from the west till it ran into a dark bank in the southeast that he somehow knew was the coast of Nuria. It was strange seeing it from this place he had only ever heard of before in whispers and illusions, knowing that the familiar things of that far coastline were lost to him, perhaps forever. His breath was steaming up the pane just in front of his face, for he had virtually pressed his nose to it. He reached out tentatively and touched the cold crystal. Kenath's voice broke in on his thoughts.
Quite a view on its own, isn't it?
He strode forward to the window.
Not much use if the weather is not clear, though. But from here I can see all I wish to see.
There was an odd little hesitation.
From here my glance may penetrate locked doors and sealed chambers where the mighty hatch their grand designs and secret schemes, where the wicked plot in darkness, and even the fallen masters crave an impossible return to their former estate.
He sighed.
I explore their dungeons and observe the horrors they conceal behind screens of fog, tree, or mountain, whether it be in the jungles of the Southland, the vales of Aryn, or the marshes of Tirallen. Little of what they do escapes me, though sometimes it is not clear what they intend.
Gareth was more than a little astonished.
You can glimpse the Southland from here?
The man smiled.
Even if one could, how would one pierce the thickets of trees and underbrush? There are other ways of seeing, apart from the eyes.
He tilted his head again in the odd way he had.
You have the gift. Let me show you.
What followed was at once alarming and exhilarating. Again there was the icy touch of Kenath's hand, this time at the back of his neck, but there was no corresponding rush of dizziness or sensation of movement. He yielded to the man's will, partly because he trusted him, partly because he suspected that they desired a visit to the same place. Talon glanced behind him as he passed through the doorway into the king's anteroom. He could not shake the feeling of discomfort, though, and it did not improve his mood. Fengor was still dressed in the drab colors of mourning, but his expression betrayed his excellent humor. He curtly instructed the liveried servant to pour another cup of wine for his visitor, and then dismissed him with a nod. Talon took the proffered cup, and with one more glance in the direction of the door, seated himself.
Our plans march on apace. You have heard of Venger's demise.
The king's enthusiasm spilled over into his words.
I have, and more importantly, the demise of several hundred of Ligerium's best soldiers. But I believe it is a little too early to celebrate.
Talon tilted the cup of wine so that the contents caught the light.
Of course, old friend, but we could not have asked for a better commencement than this. Turek suspects nothing. Melvor is on his way to Lysan with 600 picked soldiers. Before they realize it, the Ligerians will find themselves between the hammer and the anvil.
They may resist more than you and Malik have anticipated, and they may not subject themselves too passively to occupation after all.
Ah, you have grown old, my friend. The planning and scheming is all that gives you pleasure now, but for me, it is all too many wasted seasons before we can strike the blow. Ligerium was ripe for the plucking several cycles ago. You and Malik Yulian seem to have little stomach for risk.
Talon smiled indulgently.
Call it age if you wish. I prefer to think things through and not run into any unpleasant surprises.
He sipped the wine.
There have been no tidings of the lost shepherd boy?
Another instance of your overcaution. He is probably still running, if a wild beast has not devoured him. By the remains, it seemed that the tour enjoyed themselves thoroughly. They have a thirst for blood, and no mistake. I felt sorry for the poor child when I saw what they had left of him. Why did they have to break him like that?
There was some irritation in the questor's voice.
Did Lucane not inform you it was a requirement?
Yes. But was it necessary to make him suffer?
Talon snorted his disgust.
The quick pity a cruel end engenders. Do you not find it a relief that he no longer poisons your thoughts and consciousness with his unbearable existence? Did he actually mean something to you?
You took his part when the truth was known. I would have thought...
Yes, and it was a mistake that I admit to. But now it has been made good, despite his mother's meddling on his behalf and poor Captain Melvor's good intentions.
Gareth fought to stay in the room with them. Some painful fascination wanted him to hear every hurtful thing they could say, wanted to feed his growing hatred and loathing till it would fill the hollow in his chest. But the grip was firm and compelling, dragging him from the depths of the vision.
Save your strength for the pass. You will need it.
He was breathing heavily, trying to regain some form of composure. He realized quickly that the giddiness and sudden fatigue that he had felt had not been caused by the overheard conversation, but rather the strain of lingering in that far place. It was somewhat like a swimmer lingering under the surface of the water till it was almost too late.
I kept you longer than I had intended. I am sorry.
Kenneth's words were a little distant. Gareth wondered for a moment whether it was what they had witnessed rather than lingering for such a length of time for which he was sorry.
There! You saw for yourself. They hate me.
Have you given them cause?
The boy felt slightly betrayed at these words.
No! Yes, perhaps.
He hesitated. A long history of defiance and disobedience suggested itself to him. He thought of the captain's son, Garrett, who had been coldly executed for the same crime he had unwittingly committed.
And what was it that you did?
Gareth looked up at the man. His eyes were large and staring.
I touched the forbidden stone in the temple. I never intended to. It just came about that way.
Kenneth turned away and brought a hand up to his chin.
It was you, then.
What? You know? How could you know about that? Did you see it here?
The man turned away to the window and the view below.
There are too many things to tell you in the little time we have left. That stone was taken from this mountain when Veer's way fell into disrepute. It was once part of the initiate's course, the becoming ritual of the Veeron, and it still echoes here in the emptiness. I am aware of it always, though it be distant and unused.
Then you would know what happened to me. I saw the bird.
No! Never speak of what you saw.
The voice rang loudly in the room.
You realize it not, but the storm brewing for over 1,000 cycles is about to break over the children of Veer with irresistible force, and they have none of the arcane protections that could have saved them. You are young, boy, but I felt the trembling of the stone and the urgency when you touched it. There are no simple destinies in a time like this. The vision was your own pressing opportunity, great or small, to come to the aid of your race.
But I do not understand it. There were too many images, and I knew I could not turn the man around.
Hold your peace, foolish child. Did I not tell you not to spill your secrets to the four winds? You have no idea what enemies are out to destroy you, or you would hardly bear thinking of it. There is no place in all of Myril that one may speak of such things in safety. You will understand what to do when the time comes, and I can assure you that you will not have long to wait.
Gareth stared at him miserably. Here was only more confusion and uncertainty.
I am aware of you now, since you pulled on the stone. That is why I waited in the pass, though I mistook you for someone else at first.
Someone else?
A relation of yours. But when you approached, I saw that you were only a child.
A relation? There is no one but my half-brother and father. Unless you mean my mother's father, Count Byron, or his son.
There is yet another.
The boy looked at him dumbly and then realized.
Oh.
Yes, he is a grown man, but when I perceived you, I did not do so with my eyes or ears. Though your talents are vastly different, there's a strong kinship between you and Lord Ruin.
Gareth flinched slightly at the name.
We are forbidden, on pain of death, to mention him in Nuria. He was involved in an incident that caused his banishment, a kin murder. He killed his brother, my uncle, but that was before I was born. Please, you must understand that laws are very strict there.
The man smiled knowingly.
I am not all that ignorant regarding the Nurians.
He placed a strange emphasis on the last word, as if it amused him, yet his eyes carried an expression of sadness.
I dreamed of him once. I was small still. The nurse gave a little cry when I told her, and she explained to me that we were not allowed talking about him. Yet people whispered when they thought it safe, for he was as good as an object of gossip as you can imagine. I never knew what to believe about him.
He tried to remember all the rumors and absurdities surrounding his enigma of an uncle, but they had mostly faded to a general vagueness suggestive of brigandage and transgression.
He came here, then?
No. He has not been here, but he will come.
His face had settled into a mask, not of a certain expectation, but rather of apprehension. It returned to him all the oddness that had enshrouded him in the past, to such a degree that Gareth took an uncertain step backwards. The expression remained for a moment only.
But you may see him ere I do.
He smiled.
Come, I have to return you to the pass now.
Gareth was far from ready to leave. He knew he had found the person who could give him at least some of the answers he longed to find. It was not right that the opportunity should slip away again so quickly. Moreover, he had nowhere to go, apart from the hostile Aryn, where he knew not a soul. As Kenneth stepped closer, desperation spurred him to action.
Couldn't I stay here with you?
The words were out in a rush.
I could serve in any fashion you desire. You must need help sometimes. I could sort the scrolls for you, or I could...
Kenneth held up his hand, smiling.
You would be surprised how little I actually need. Besides, I have Sith to sort my scrolls.
There was a hint of regret.
The agreement still stands, and I have transgressed already on your account. If it was my decision alone, I would welcome an acolyte, especially one with your talent. But your fate is not in my hands. It will find you soon, or not at all, and it will be in a place far distant from this one.
There had been a gentle fall of snow recently, and the wind had receded to a mere whisper. Yet even this slight stirring seemed to penetrate the marrow of his bones. Moreover, he would have to stop for a rest. His stumbling progress might well cause him injury if he tripped over some hidden obstruction. He could hardly drag himself any further. What had Kenneth said? 3 miles at best? It felt as though he had been at it for more than 10. He needed to rest, just a little. The tree was made to lean against. At least that was how it felt. But his limbs were growing numb with cold, now that he was no longer moving. He closed his eyes for a moment, and imagined the luxury of the hot, soapy water in the tub rooms of Belruth Castle. Slipping into the barrel-shaped tub, at first caused the burning sensation on the skin that was oddly akin to the initial contact with snow. He could feel the warmth engulfing his body, gradually thawing his frozen feet and hands. Then he thought of the supper tables, groaning under seasoned stews or joints of meat, fresh pastries and golden round fruit. He was thirsty, maddeningly so. He compressed the powdery snow into a lump and placed it in his mouth. It tasted of nothing much, not having been in contact with the forest soil or vegetation. He could recall the distinct taste of the water in Belruth, a faint stony flavor from the cisterns and conduits. He had never cared for the mulled wine or ale on which others seemed to live. It had made him sick when he had tasted it for the first time as just a little child. Since then he had refused it in favor of milk or water. The taste of water instantly brought memories to his mind. The well at the ancient oak, cobbled and musty but sweet. The dark weed, which changed with the seasons. Sometimes heather and gorse, sometimes nothing but sunlight and air. The still pools that carried a hint of needle trees. His own mirror pool with its cool, mossy mystery. He could no longer see the trees around him or feel the cold. Instead, there was a deep ache for the places he would not dare visit again. Perhaps when he was old, and no one could remember him any more. He was surprised to find how intensely his being was entwined with the stone and soil of his home. He loved it, its streets, its groves, its towering strength. But it was all beyond his reach now. He was so terribly tired, of the cold, the hunger, of running and hiding, of secrets and mysteries. His mind and body ached with it. He wanted to rest for just a little while.
It's a Viron warrior.
Cadet, more like. Look at the size of him.
Is he?
You never know with a Viron.
Aryn pulled off the fur-lined glove and pressed his fingers against the cold, pale skin just below the chin. The boy's eyelids flickered briefly, and he seemed to move away from the touch. There was a rasp of metal as Lur drew his dagger.
Step back. This is a trap.
Aryn hardly moved, but withdrew his hand slowly.
No trap. His candle's just about snuffed. An hour or two longer, and he will never wake up.
Let him lie, then. One fewer to dispatch ourselves.
Aryn turned the lifeless form on its side. The hair was wet at the back of the head where it had pressed into the snow. There were no signs of injury.
Let him lie, I say. Or would you rather I slit his throat to make sure?
Aren't you the least bit curious about him? How did he get to be on this side of the pass?
A filthy spy. Or some stripling warlock that met his match in this accursed cold. What's there to be curious about?
He is wearing a uniform of the Royal Nurian Guard, for which he seems too young. It is also hardly the outfit to wear in these conditions. Did he stray from an encampment of some Nurian raiders that slipped through the pass somehow? It could be that while we wonder about him, the Nurians are already streaming down to the plains to burn and kill.
Ye think too much, I've always said. This brat could hardly be from a larger group. We would have received warning from the spy posts further up. How he slipped past them, I have no idea. I still hold with enchantment. There's some foul magic afoot. I feel it in my bones.
The cold is all I feel in mine, friend Lur. I've set my mind to question this young spy, if that's what he is. There's more to this than appears on the surface.
Aryn pulled his glove back on and lifted the unmoving form into his arms. Hardly glancing back at the disapproving Lur, he flung the boy over his shoulder and stalked off into the growing gloom.
Bring the rabbit, will you? I've hunger enough for two tonight.
You're fool enough for two tonight.
Lur mumbled under his breath as he sheathed the dagger and picked up the meager proceeds from their traps.
Lur placed the empty bowl next to him and belched contentedly. He drank deeply from his cup of watered wine and glanced over at his captain, who seemed lost in thought, his brow slightly creased. He sat with his one side towards the fire, consuming the last of the bowl of stew at his leisure. The fire was larger than usual, and contained thicker logs that would burn all night. Its size mattered little in terms of giving away their position, since the skins of the tent hut were properly sealed against the cold. The shadows on his face shifted with the leaping flames, and his seated figure expanded and contracted in rapid succession on the skin wall behind him. The men were sitting in their shirt sleeves and hose, soaking in the heat. Their knee-length boots were ranged in a neat line close to the fire. A small lump of fragrant tallow softened on a log for later application. The firewood was dry and released an almost smokeless, rather pleasant aroma. Lur was growing uneasy with the long pensive silence. He stretched out his legs and made an attempt.
Good thing we'll be relieved soon. It's not the same without blackroot, eh? Goes uncommonly well with rabbit, blackroot.
He emptied his cup. Aryn put aside his bowl and fixed his eyes on the glowing logs.
There is something that puzzles me greatly about this boy. He was carrying no supplies, had no weapon for hunting, and no means of making a fire. He could not have come through the pass on his own without these. Therefore he must be part of some group. Scouts, perhaps? Yet that uniform.
He gestured towards the wet clothes draped over a stool at the far side of the fire.
Would never have been worn by a scout. A raiding party of significant size would have been detected long ere now. Still, he must be part of a larger group of some kind.
Why concern yourself with it? Let me...
Lur, you will not touch that boy. Can't you see that we need to discover the truth here? Even so, I cannot simply slit the throat of a child.
Ye are letting the whole tragedy with your son cloud the reasoning. This is not Zane back from across the endless ocean. It's a filthy Viron pup, poisonous and vile. I will destroy him if ye have not the heart. I'll give it to ye. He looks harmless enough, all young and not unseemly, but ye forget the sorceries they are capable of.
The Nurians have not sullied their hands with sorcery for generations now, Lur.
Aryn sounded tired and a little irritated.
Now they are Nurians. It's a front to hide their wretched Viron nature. Traitors and sorcerers. That's what they truly are.
Aryn sighed in exasperation. He turned on his folding stool and faced the fire. The mention of his son's death had stirred the ache he had been trying to smother for over 6 seasons now. It was hard to believe it had been that long. 10 days. Yet it was still as close as if it had been yesterday. How could it not affect him? But would it cloud his judgment? He believed not. Lur was being foolish. He looked over to his left at the motionless form of their captive. The boy's face was flushed, his mouth slightly open. They had cocooned him between 2 bearskins, and had piled another on top. He seemed feverish, though, probably in reaction to the exposure and exhaustion. His dress was extremely odd and inappropriate. A single pair of hose, albeit of excellent quality, a shirt and a surcoat, could never keep out the cold one would have to endure on such a trip. He hadn't even worn an undershirt. It seemed then that he had not planned on braving the pass. Was he attempting to escape from someone? Perhaps a master who had ill-treated him. But why flee into the pass? He had to have known that mortal enemies of Nuria would capture him. What fate had he tried to escape that this would be preferable? He was young. Perhaps he hadn't been thinking at all. Lur was also looking at him now.
Something else. I know enough about these Viron to find it strange we didn't see a single sign of frostbite on him. He wasn't even attired to prevent it.
Perhaps he had traveled in a litter. Could he be the servant of some high officer? It could not have been long since he strayed from his party. Were they diplomats?
Diplomats? From Nuria? I doubt whether they know what those are.
There has to be a group of some kind out there, Lur. He could not have crossed this far all the way from Nuria by himself.
He stood up abruptly and crossed over to the boots.
I will have to do a little scouting tonight, then.
Yay? Why not us?
I'll have to leave you with the captive, of course.
Captive be damned. If you would just...
Aryn cut him short.
That's quite enough from you. I've made my decision regarding this boy, and there an end.
He pulled on the second pair of hose and his boots. Then he donned the sleeveless fleece coat and his hooded fur jacket.
I'll be in just before dawn, regardless if I could locate them. You'll have to stay up. We can't have the little bird fly the nest now.
Lur was not to be placated.
I live to see the day. Why not simply truss him up?
He'll be in a fever soon. I'd like to ask him questions tomorrow, not dig his grave.
I'd simply leave him to the wolves.
You'd better simply follow orders.
Of course, but playing nurse to Viron whelps.
Aryn pulled back the flap that served as a door.
What would you do if you couldn't grumble, Lur? You'd be miserable.
He stepped through the hole.
At least there's no wind. I'll fasten the flap from outside.
Then he strode off into the night. It was difficult to stay awake in the comforting warmth. Lur was worn out with the effort when Aryn reappeared through the hole. The darkness was already lifting outside.
Tiring work watching a sleeper, eh?
Aryn smiled at the bleary-eyed man.
Has he stirred yet?
Once or twice. But he hasn't woken. He's flushed and hot. I removed one of the skins.
He stretched and yawned.
I need to stretch my legs. Then I'll be fresh again.
Good. I'll warm the stew for us. Then I'll have to leave you here again.
Did you find something then?
I followed his tracks for a while, but lost them ere long. I need daylight to see what there is to see.
He busied himself with the pots. Lur dressed himself and set off to find fresh-looking snow to clear his head. When he returned, Aryn was ready to depart. He took some bread and the water skin, as well as his bow.
I could be back tomorrow morning or afternoon, but not later than that. It would give me enough time to scout the next 2 watches as well, in case the fellows up there are as watchful as you.
He smiled and pointed at the boy.
Try to get some water or wine into him. If he wakes, don't say a word to him.
No fear of that, sir. I can't speak his language.
Not even in your own, then.
With that, he stepped out and trudged off into the trees. The morning was a little gray, the sky overcast and darkening. They could be in for bad weather. Lur's suspicions revived when he felt awake again. He was horrified to think he could have fallen asleep in the presence of a Virhan demon, even a feeble young one. All drowsiness was banished at the thought. He needed something with which to occupy himself, to take his mind off sleeping, or it would be a dreary day indeed. He set about cleaning and servicing his gear, rearranging the stack of firewood and the meager furniture, and finally waxing his boots a second time. A substantial portion of the tallow remained. He glanced at the sleeping figure, then at the smaller pair of boots next to him. They seemed good and sturdy. He picked one up. It was surprisingly light and well-made. It would reach only halfway to the knee, and fastened on the outside of the leg with 3 buckled straps, one just above the ankle, one at the top, and another halfway between. It was rather scuffed, and badly in need of waxing. Strictly because he needed something to do, of course, and because he was curious to see it in good condition, he applied the remaining tallow first to one, and then the other. He placed them neatly with the other clothes that had dried during the night. A strange feeling made him look round guiltily. The boy's eyes were open wide, staring at him fixedly. A little shock went through him. The queer, feline eyes sent a shiver up his spine. Then the boy spoke. It was a single word only, and sounded like a name, but he could not be sure. There was something strange about the voice, too, something unnatural. Lur was experienced enough to detect the tone of delirium. He let out his breath in relief. The boy had not seen him at all. His eyes were glassy and staring. Neither had he addressed him. He was trapped in a feverish world of his own. Lur woke with a start. For a moment or two he was confused. Then he cursed himself roundly and sat up. All was deathly quiet in the tent. The fire had died down to glowing embers now, but it was still warm enough inside, despite the howling of the wind.
It had to be some time after daybreak, but with the overcast sky it would be impossible to tell. Then he realized the moaning and mumbling had stopped. He was on his feet in a flash. The clothes were still there, neatly folded. So was the boy. He was sleeping, though. The flush of fever had disappeared. He was lying on his stomach, facing away from the fire, half twisted out of the fur covering. Not for the first time, Lur felt a stirring of sympathy for this unknown child, and a longing for his own 3 children back in Kiel. He drew the cover gently over the bare shoulders. Almost at the same time, he heard the shout and a beating at the tent opening. It was Aryn's voice. He hurried to undo the fastenings. Aryn tumbled in with a flurry of snow. He was out of breath and looked a little haggard. He unstrung the bow with a practiced movement and flung it down carelessly. Then he produced 2 sizable rabbits from his pouch and smiled.
This should keep the pot going, eh? Had time to check the traps on the way back before the snow came down.
He shook himself and started removing his jacket. Lur took the welcome proceeds and busied himself with the gutting immediately. He was impatient to hear what Aryn had found, but knew that he would relate it in his own time. When he had expertly skinned and cleaned the animals, Aryn had already stirred up the fire and seated himself in front of it with a cup of wine. He still carried the perplexed mood in which he had departed the day before. It turned out that he did not have much to report. The tracks had been faint and difficult to follow. At some point they had disappeared entirely, as if the boy had indeed materialized out of thin air. He had carried on despite this, hoping to catch sight of the party of diplomats or raiders the boy had belonged to, but without success. He had not so much as found a trace that such a party existed.
No, my friend, the secret is locked up in that boy there, and he will tell us when he wakes up.
Aryn drained his cup with a gulp.
As he slept all this time.
He was fevered. If that counts for being awake, then he hardly slept any.
Why so?
He was talking. All day and all night. Couldn't make it out, of course. But it was sad, like. Times he would toss and turn, frantic almost. Then he would moan and whimper like a kicked dog. All the time he looked at me without seeing me. I had to force the water down his throat.
Lur motioned to the water skins as if in support of what he said.
Then I must have dozed off. When I woke shortly after dawn, he was as you see him now, sound asleep.
Aryn had realized at once that his companion's outspoken enmity towards their captive had all but faded away during the time he had had to care for him. He was more than a little pleased, for somehow he sensed no underhandedness or threat in the presence of this strange boy.
Bring on that cauldron, Lur. I'm half starved to death.
Gareth woke to a loud snoring. He felt empty and strange, but warm and comfortable at the same time. His thoughts were a jumble of confused memories, of which he could make little sense, and that seemed incongruous with his present state. He was in bed. Which bed, he had no idea. He remembered the intolerable cold, the overwhelming need to sleep, but nothing beyond that. He opened his eyes slowly. Before he could make sense of anything he saw, the snoring stopped abruptly, and he heard someone speak angrily and sit up. He shut his eyes again. There was a step behind him, and the nape of his neck prickled in anticipation. He had to clench his teeth to remain motionless as the cover was drawn up over his bare shoulders. Then there was a muffled shout and a beating on the outside of the structure he was in. At the same time, he became aware of the howling wind, and that they had taken his clothes. He was alive, though, and unbound. That at least pointed to good intentions on the side of his hosts. The men spoke in a strange language, but he liked the sound of it. Throughout their discourse he remained motionless, pretending to be asleep, half out of fear of what would happen to him when they perceived he was awake. The newly arrived man sat down behind him and spoke in troubled tones. As he related his tale, Gareth experienced an odd sensation. The words spoken became more and more familiar to him, as if he was supposed to remember them and know them. His mind whirled frustratingly, seemingly of its own accord, struggling to string together the identified sounds into images. Every newly spoken word became an agony of clearing perception and meaning. Then the other man spoke, and the exasperation deepened. He longed to cover his ears, to block out the sound and end the intensifying prickling in his head. The conversation stopped as the men busied themselves with cooking. Gareth knew he would have to move sooner or later. The position he was in suddenly became awkward and uncomfortable. His stomach cramped with hunger, and the first smell of cooking filled the room. The men could not be hostile, for they would have bound him hand and foot, and had not one of them covered him up almost caringly. The conversation picked up again. One stirred in the pot, while the other sat close to him talking. The sounds were frighteningly familiar now, and settled slowly like ripples on a pond glazing into a steady reflection, into meaning. He could understand them. What was more, he was convinced he could speak their language when required. They conversed at length about their hometown of Kiel, the state of their fishing nets and equipment, and the upcoming boat race at Aryn Rock. He learned their names and something about their natures, that they were not soldiers by profession or violent out of habit. He turned under the delicious warmth of the pelt and faced them. His sudden move caused little surprise. Aryn had suspected that he had been awake for some time. Lur was the first to speak.
There he is now, back from the land of dreams.
Aryn was struck at once by the strangeness of the boy's eyes. For a moment they caught the light of the fire and flashed it at him like two polished coins of gold. It gave him an inhuman quality, an animal gaze. They betrayed no fear, but stared at him fixedly, as if they were waiting for an explanation.
It only occurred to me now that neither of us speak a word of Nurian, Lur. Do you think he can speak the track tongue?
Aryn was nonplussed. Gareth smiled at him.
I can speak to you in your language, sir.
He had to keep himself from laughing. It was a strange sensation, as if he was diving into an icy pool on a hot day, exhilarating and yet a little frightening. Aryn glanced at Lur, who was equally taken aback. There was a slight accent, but the meaning was clear.
Diplomats,
he ventured.
Spies.
Lur shot back. Gareth sat up and pulled the skin up to his chest.
What do you mean to do with me? Are you men from Aryn?
we are men from Aryn, yes. I'm Aryn, captain of the advanced border guard. You are now in Aryn, and as we are at war with Nuria, you will have to consider yourself a prisoner.
The boy seemed relieved at these words, even content. Was he indeed a runaway then?
What we require from you at present is truthful information concerning yourself and your presence here. Do not attempt to lie to me, boy. It will go ill with you when I find you out.
He was gratified to see the boy pale at his words, although his tone had not been threatening. Gareth had realized his predicament. How could he possibly tell this man the truth? He could not even risk telling them who he was. Wouldn't the Arynites use him as a bargaining tool of some kind against the Nurians? Wouldn't the latter reach some agreement only to get him back? How could he explain what had happened on the mountain and not seem a liar? He had made no plans beyond reaching Aryn, hostile though it was.
You need have no fear, as long as you tell the truth.
Aryn looked him squarely in the eyes. Gareth shivered involuntarily, half from cold and half from apprehension. He hugged the fur closer to him. Aryn relented a little.
We'll first feed you, and then you'll give us what we want.
He stood up, instructed Lur to fill 3 bowls and cups, and strode to his back. He took out a clean shirt and tossed it to the boy. Although it was far too large, Gareth pulled it on gratefully. The cold had a way of creeping past the fire and insulated hide walls. Then he accepted the bowl and cup from Lur, and fell to ravenously, burning his tongue on the first few attempts to wolf down the hot food. He could not remember eating anything as good. They ate in silence, except for Lur warning the boy that he would choke to death, and assuring him that the food would wait patiently in his bowl to be eaten, and not disappear if he looked the other way. Everyn chuckled within himself at the memory of Lur's readiness to slit the throat he was now trying to protect. Gareth answered with his eyes, his mouth being occupied. He accepted a second and third bowl, on which he finally slowed down to a healthier pace. He refused the cup of wine, and Lur replaced it with water, which he gulped down just as greedily. Lur could not help commenting on the apparent scarcity of victuals in Nuria. Gareth sighed contentedly, flung aside the bearskin, and rose unsteadily to his feet. He stood facing Everyn, the shirt reaching almost to his knees, the paleness of a while before gone from his face. He inclined his head briefly to the astonished man and said,
I thank you kindly, sir. I will find a way to repay you.
On your own, boy, you would never have reached as far as the towers.
Gareth smiled hopelessly.
I'm trapped.
Yes, you are. Now I would like to have the truth. All of it.
A note of severity had crept back into the man's voice. Gareth looked down at the tips of his newly waxed boots, and thought that the Arynites was just one more thing about which the priests had been lying. From what he had been made to believe, he expected some very rough usage from the brutes that inhabited that cursed realm to the west. Instead, they had saved him from the cold, fed him, and cared for him, and in return they would only receive some explanation as to his presence here, some fabrication gleaned from the many similar stories he had had to produce for tutors, guards, or chamberlains in the cycles past. Yet this time, the exposition would have to be of a different order to be convincing. He had spent most of the night thinking about it, and still there were events impossible to clarify. In the end, he had decided to stay as close to the truth as was safe. With enough hesitation to lend authenticity to his tale, he related the incidents which led to his flight into the pass, his strange experiences within the towers, and his subsequent transportation to the Arynite side of the lake. He was a trainee in the guard, hence the uniform, and had fallen foul of his captain, whom he claimed despised him utterly, on many occasions. He had not been the best of soldiers, he admitted, but then his master was cruel and merciless, punishing the smallest offense with the utmost severity. It was not too long before he had devised plans to slip away on 10th days to where the taskmaster could not reach him. That is how it came about that he had witnessed a terrible crime, one that was hard to recount to them. Here he did not have to fake the shaking in his voice, or the tears he quickly blinked away, for the memory of the death tree was still all too fresh. He had seen the questor's hired hands murder the younger prince of Nuria in a most horrid fashion, and in his distress had betrayed his presence to these assailants. Here both Lur and Everyn expressed their astonishment. The shock of this revelation prompted them to believe the rest of the tale, and certainly this was something they could easily verify. He had managed to evade the assassins in the thick underbrush, but since they knew his identity, and he theirs, and therefore their master's, he was a fugitive. They had hounded him for days, forcing him towards the pass, and his only hope of escape, their enemies in Aryn. Now the tale twisted into the fantastic. He briefly related the episode involving his miraculous rescue by Kenath, the vast domain inside the towers, and his appearance on the far side of the lake. He left out any form of detail except to the physical aspect of the place. There was what he thought to be a disbelieving silence in response. Everyn was the first to speak.
The latter part of his tale, however unbelievable, certainly bears out what I could decipher from his tracks. Moreover, we know about the strange resident of the towers. and that no one wanders into his realm unbidden.
That is a folk tale.
This from Lur.
Petrak of Envy will testify of its truth. Ask him about his experiences when we see him at the rock in the first 10 day of reapage.
Patrak is an old drunk, and you're a fool to believe him.
Of course, Lur. Anything you have not seen cannot be possible.
That is not...
Then stop judging before you know all of the matter.
Aryn seldom raised his voice, but now he was clearly irritated. He did not like being called a fool by a subordinate, even if he happened to be a friend and had many cycles more. Lur knew he had overstepped the bounds and kept silent, while Aryn addressed himself to his captive again.
In all of this, boy, you have not told us who you are.
Gareth tried to look him squarely in the eye.
My name is Neil Seth Euban of Belruth. My father is dead, and when I was placed in the guard, my mother went back to her people in Monstor, about 80 miles to the south and east. She does not know where I am.
He was more nervous at this falsehood than he had anticipated, and fervently hoped that his anxiety would be regarded as perplexity.
Well, Neil Seth Euban, if indeed your story is the truth, you are most fortunate to be alive.
He folded his arms and looked pensive.
What is to become of me?
The concern in his voice was quite real. Aryn was contemplating this very question. Who would believe such a fantastic story without some evidence? He had to admit to himself that it was credible to him only because he had been the one to find the boy and knew the circumstances. Would he be locked away somewhere as a suspected spy? He was suddenly fearful that this was exactly what would befall the child if he did not act to prevent it.
We will take you down to Grin's Keep regardless, and there we can decide what is to be done with you. We'll leave on the morrow.
There would be a day or two of steady walking during which he could think of what to do.